speaker tonight is Jack Kelly.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Well, thank you, Kathy, and thank you for being here. I'm glad you were able to make this one. And Kathy's really set the scene. This is the 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War as we speak is going on, because the Revolutionary War started in April of 1775. Next year is going to be the big event when we get to 4th of July and the actual 250th of the formation of the United States. I think it's really a time that we can reflect on both the fundamental values that were put forth in the revolution and also the sacrifice that was needed to make those values a reality. And I'm going to be talking tonight about a book that I did a few years ago called Band of Giants that's sort of an overview of the Revolutionary War, spotlighting various characters who are some of the more famous officers on the Patriot side and what their contributions were. And I think that the thing to keep in mind about the Revolutionary War is it's not a fairy tale. It's not a story about chopping down a cherry tree or I cannot tell a lie. You know, I always thought, well, if you can't tell a lie, why'd you chop the cherry tree down? It's about a serious, violent, prolonged struggle that really formed an epic in human history, and too often is forgotten. We live here in the Hudson Valley. We have Greene County, Sullivan County, Putnam County, Montgomery County, and these were all named after great heroes of the Revolutionary War. And you ask people, they draw a blank as who it's named after. I include myself in that. I grew up in Wayne County, up near Rochester. It was the first of 14 Wayne counties in America. We never had a statue of Anthony Wayne. We never had an Anthony Wayne Day. And we never learned why Mad Anthony Wayne was mad. So I think the 250th would give an opportunity, and I like to look at the reality of those people that fought the revolution. Not always easy, after 250 years, but I think there's a few perspectives I'm going to talk about tonight of how to sort of reach back and get at the reality of the various people who were prominent in the revolutionary era. And I think the first of these techniques or strategies is to keep in mind that the effect of war on human mind, it's really a truth that goes back to Homer and is as relevant as the veterans coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq today. The Revolutionary War was not a costume drama. The battles were nightmarish. The conditions that they fought in were often horrific, particularly for the Patriot soldiers. There's a cliche about them walking barefoot in the snow. Wasn't really a cliche. There's many verified witnesses testified to that, and you could follow the tracks of the army by the bloody footprints of the troops. So it was a brutal event. We know more now about the effect of the intensity of combat on the human mind, post-traumatic stress disorder, but there's no reason to think that it didn't exist back then. There was a story about the Battle of Saratoga. It was up on the Hudson River, one of the greatest victories for the Patriots, the turning point of the Revolutionary War. But there was a man who fought there named John Henry, 20 years old. He was a lieutenant for the Patriots. And his father was Patrick Henry, who was the governor of Virginia and famous for saying, give me liberty or give me death. But he said that in the State House in Virginia, not on the battlefield. And his son was there at the battle. And after this great victory, he went around and looked in the faces of men that he had led and men that were his friends who'd been killed, and he had a nervous breakdown. And he took his sword out, he broke it over his knee, and he went raving mad for a while, disappeared for quite a while, and then never fought again. So that was the effect on that one person. The intensity of the horror of the battle. And I think this, one of the people that this perspective illuminates a little bit is Richard Montgomery. If anybody's been over to, there's a town over on the eastern part of the county called Rhinebeck. Some of you have probably been there. And there's a Montgomery Street, and there's other things named Montgomery over there. It was all for Richard Montgomery. He was an Irishman, went to Trinity College in Dublin, decided to drop out and join the British Army when he was 18. And he was very quickly sent off to war in America during the French and Indian War in the 1750s. He saw a lot of action there. When he was 23, he was sent down to Havana for a very horrific siege of when the British were fighting the Spanish in Cuba. He got sick. A lot of people got yellow fever. He wanted to go home. Instead, they sent him out to what's now Detroit area to deal with an Indian rebellion. I guess they didn't like having their land taken away from them. Pontiac's Rebellion, it was called. And after that, he went back to England, and he really had enough of war. He resigned his commission and sold his commission in the British Army. And in 1772, he came to America. And he settled first in New York, and then he came up here. He had met Janet Livingston, who was the heir to the Livingston estate over in Claremont when he was here the first time in America. And when he got back 10 years later, she was still single, and he married her. And they settled in Rhinebeck. And their house that they lived in is still there in Rhinebeck, now the headquarters, the local headquarters of the DAR. And Richard Montgomery was described as melancholy, a melancholy man. And that was their word for depression. And Janet, his wife, wanted to have children. He didn't want children. He said, "I'm happy, but my happiness has no foundation." He said, "I just want to be a farmer." And so they bought a farm outside of Rhinebeck. And we can't really know whether his war experience is what left him with this depression, but it's easy to imagine that he was carrying the burden that so many former soldiers carry, that he'd been scarred by war. But when the revolution started, he decided that it was his duty to volunteer for his adopted country. They were in desperate need of experienced officers. And he signed up, and they sent him up to Canada to lead the invasion of Canada. It was one of the less successful operations by the Patriots in 1775. They thought the Canadians would join in with the revolution, and they were wrong. Before Montgomery left, he said to his brother-in-law, "I had thought the world was mad. Now I know it is." Because he was going up there to fight against the very same people that had been his close comrades in the British Army. But he continued to brood when he got up there. Janet sent him letters. She was concerned about him. And he wrote back to her and said, "Stop sending me these whining letters." And it was a little indication, you can imagine the gulf that opens up between spouses where one is in the military and the other one can't really understand what they're going through. And the last day of 1775, Montgomery had gotten up as far as the city of Quebec, a walled city. He decided to give it a try to storm it, even though he didn't really have the troops or the artillery to do that. And in the middle of a raging blizzard, they attacked the city. Montgomery was killed, and hundreds of his men were taken prisoner. So he was the first great martyr of the war. He was the highest ranking general that was killed in the entire war. And the idea that I have about him is not to try to psychoanalyze him so much as to imagine him more clearly, perhaps as a person who had suffered from war and yet who had devoted himself to the cause in spite of that burden that he carried and that many veterans do carry. The second kind of strategy I have to try to get in touch with these people is that to keep in mind that during the war, and this was our longest war until the war in Vietnam. The Revolutionary War went on for 8 years. And the major fighting for 6 years, and then there was another 2 years before the peace was signed. And that's a big chunk of people's lives. And if we keep in mind that not only were they fighting a war, but they were living their lives. They were falling in love and getting married and having children and getting sick. They were having financial problems. A lot of American officers had financial problems because they rarely got paid. And they were just simply growing older. Their lives were passing, and people didn't live that long in those days. So rather than focus entirely on the historical events that they were involved in, I think if we think about their lives, it's a way of getting at them. And the example I would give is Henry Knox. Henry Knox was a bookseller in Boston before the war. And a lot of people have said to me, well, that's incongruous, or that's sort of ironic, this effete book store owner becoming a great soldier. But in fact, there was a rationale behind it because Knox had access to information. He sold books on military techniques and tactics and the latest military technology from a store, and he read them before he sold them. So he became very well informed about the latest developments in military science. He was a very big man. He liked the big guns, and he got involved with a militia unit that was an artillery unit in Boston. And then when the war began, the battle at Lexington and Concord, the Patriots besieged Boston and trapped the British Army in Boston. Henry Knox and his wife, whose name was Lucy Flucker, who he had just married, were trapped also in the city and had to escape in the dark of night. Henry joined with George Washington in the Patriot Army that was carrying on the siege. And George Washington had a great talent for spotting ability among his subordinates, and he immediately lifted Knox up to become the head of artillery and really promoted him above many more experienced soldiers. And Knox not only was head of artillery, but he became Washington's most trusted advisor for the entire war. And some of his accomplishments, the first one was to take the guns from Fort Ticonderoga. And if you ever drive up the Northway, you go past Lake George and you're still going north. Up at the other end of Lake George is Fort Ticonderoga, and they took dozens of cannon in the winter, put them on sleds that they built, dragged them down to Albany, crossed the river, down to Kinderhook, out to Great Barrington, across the entire state of Massachusetts, and gave George Washington his first victory by driving the British out of Boston. He put the guns up on Dorchester Heights, and the British had to leave. This was all the work of Henry Knox. That same year, when Washington crossed the Delaware, it was Henry Knox that got the cannon and the artillery across the river, along with the horses to pull them, got them all the way down to Trenton in the middle of a blizzard, and again, allowed George Washington to have what was probably his greatest victory by defeating the Hessians at Trenton. While all these things were going on. While he was having these great accomplishments, Knox was living his life. He and Lucy were starting a family. She had been pregnant when they left Boston. She was afraid that she would never see her own family again because they were loyalists. And when the British left Boston, they went to England, and she never did see them again. So she had no home for 8 years. And she had to stay with friends, find rooms somewhere. She was somewhat of a snob, and she was constantly complaining about the accommodations that these people gave her. And when she could, she joined Henry in camp. She was at Valley Forge during the Valley Forge winter in 1777 and 8. And they were city people. They liked to socialize. They got up card games. They had dinner parties. And Henry was a very big, heavy man. Lucy was also very big. And so Henry had an iron bed made up that could sustain the combined weight of them. I guess because if they, while they were engaged in what were called maneuvers in the Army, they wouldn't want a wooden bed to fall apart, so it would have been embarrassing, so they had an iron bed. Lucy gave birth to 6 children during the war, and 4 of them died. And that was not unusual in those days, but it was a great tragedy. It's a major life event to lose a child like that, and they loved their children just as much as people do today. Henry was a very jovial and man. He liked to laugh, tell jokes, but the succession of tragedies that had taken place, in addition to all the stresses of the war, challenged him and challenged his faith, and he was also quite a religious man. But he continued on. He continued through the whole war up until Yorktown, and when George Washington had the Cornwallis and his army surrounded in Yorktown, it was Henry Knox that managed the siege that eventually forced the British to surrender. And I always liked the fact that Knox, when they had the victory at Yorktown, was really the end of the war, effectively the end of the war. He sent his brother out to take the news to Lucy, who wasn't with him at the time. He said, "I want to be the first to communicate good news to the charmer of my soul." So if we keep in mind the fact that these people had lives in addition to what they did in the famous acts in the Revolution, I think it makes them a little bit more three-dimensional and sort of bring us a little more empathy for what they were going through. And I would say in talking about Lucy Knox, in my research about the Revolutionary War, I was very impressed by the role of women in the war. Sometimes we hear about the women who dressed up as men and fought in the ranks, or Margaret Corbin, who fought at the Battle of Fort Washington when her husband was killed, and she continued to fire his gun until she herself was severely wounded. But those were the exceptions. The major thing that women did in the Revolutionary War was to stay home, and all the wives and the mothers and the sisters of the men, so they could go off to war. And so it was the women who kept up the farm and raised the children, and were also vulnerable to raids by loyalists or British Army or Indians. And so I think it's important not to lose sight of that fact, that the victory of the Patriots in the Revolutionary War really would have been impossible without the contribution of these women. And the final kind of approach that I use to try to understand the people of that revolutionary era is to remember that even though they were great heroes, or they're presented as great heroes, they were people they were basically amateurs. And the subtitle of my book was "The Amateur Soldiers Who Won America's Independence." And they had their doubts, and they made mistakes. And I think the person that comes to mind in that regard is Nathaniel Greene. he was considered to be the greatest general of the Revolutionary War after George Washington. And George Washington is said to have designated Greene as the person that he wanted to take over the Continental Army if Washington was killed in battle. And yet he was a man that was always plagued by this self-doubt and insecurity. He was from Rhode Island. His family were Quakers, and of course Quakers were pacifists. His father was very domineering. Nathaniel liked to read. His father said there's only one book worth reading, and that's the Bible. But Nathaniel was a dutiful son. He went into the family business. They had an iron foundry and a shipping business up in Rhode Island. And after his father died, he started going up on business up to Boston. He stopped in at Henry Knox's bookstore. They became very close friends. Greene had the money to buy the books, and he bought a lot of books on military science and made himself an expert on it. And he, back in Rhode Island, he got up a militia company and trained them and helped organize them. But when it came time for them to vote on who they wanted to be their officers, they didn't vote for him because he had a limp from an earlier injury. And they thought that to have a man limping in front of the company would not look good. He was very hurt by that. And he said, I'm going to quit then. If I'm not going to be the officer, I'm going to quit. And his friends imposed on him, and then reluctantly he said, okay, I'll march as a private. When the war started, again, because of Washington's eye for talent, Nathaniel Greene very quickly rose up the ranks and became the youngest brigadier general in the Patriot Army, and now the Continental Army. And he was put in charge of Fort Washington at a very difficult time for the Patriots in 1776. And Fort Washington was in northern Manhattan, about where the George Washington Bridge is now. And it was the last toehold that the Patriots had on the island of Manhattan. They had lost the Battle of Brooklyn. They had lost New York. The British had taken New York City, and they were threatening to take over the entire island of Manhattan. The purpose of the fort was to keep British ships from going up the Hudson River, but it didn't work. They were able to get ships through in spite of the cannon that they had up in the fort to fire at them. So Washington said to Greene, maybe we should give up the fort. There's no real point in holding on to it. But Greene said, no, it's very important, and we can hold out here for months, he said. And his headquarters is actually over in Fort Lee, which was directly across the river. The British attacked in November of 1776, and instead of months, it took them hours, and they captured Fort Washington. It was the worst disaster of the entire war for the Patriots. They lost 3,000 men there, captured by the British. And those men, almost to a man, died in captivity. That's how brutal the British were towards their prisoners of war. So for Nathaniel Greene, he knew they're not going to have a good time of it. And he'd lost, in an army that's fewer than 20,000, he'd lost 3,000 men. He almost went out of his mind, and he wrote to Henry Knox. He said, I'm mad, I feel mad, I'm vexed, I feel sick. And what's being said about me? Is my honor going to withstand this? And Washington understood that they were all amateurs, and they were going to make mistakes, and hope that he learned from it, and he kept Greene on. 2 years later, he said, I want you to become the quartermaster general. They're having terrible supply problems in the Continental Army. Greene had been a businessman, so he knew how to operate in supplies, but he didn't want to do it because he said that would take me out of the line of glory. He said, whoever heard of a quartermaster being a hero in history? But typically, he reluctantly said, okay, I'll do it. He took over as quartermaster, and for 2 years, he kept the Continental Army supplied. Very, very important. It's one of those things you don't think an awful lot about, but the logistics of carrying on a war are more important a lot of the times than the battles. Then an opportunity came for Greene to go back and become a soldier out in the field and fight a battle. But there was a catch to it, which was that he had to go south. The British in the later part of the war moved their operation down to the southern states, and they'd taken Savannah, they had taken Charleston. Those are really the only two big cities down there. And Cornwallis's army was rampaging through South Carolina on their way to North Carolina. Next stop was Virginia, and then Pennsylvania. And so Washington's army was still up around New York. So Greene said, I don't want to go down there. He knew that he wasn't going to have enough troops. He wasn't going to have enough supplies. He wasn't going to be able to draw on any support because Washington couldn't support him from outside of New York City. So he said, why don't you send Henry Knox down there? Because he can do anything. And quite cleverly, Washington said, yes, that's why I need him here. So again, reluctantly, the doubtful Nathaniel Greene said, okay, I'll do it. And he went down there and he really performed a miracle. He lost every battle, but he maneuvered Cornwallis's army in such a way that he totally wore them out until Cornwallis got so frustrated, he decided instead of marching up through North Carolina, he would put his troops on ships and take them up to Virginia straight away, which he did. Washington then saw his opportunity, rushed down from New York, surrounded Cornwallis at Yorktown on the peninsula in Virginia, and that was really the final battle of the Revolutionary War. And a lot of historians now think of that Nathaniel Greene really was the engineer of the most important and most successful campaign of the entire war. But for all these accomplishments, all through it, he had doubts about himself. And I think it's a quality that it's easy to understand, at least it is for me, that idea of self-doubt, that no matter what you do, it's like you're still never quite sure. And unfortunately, Greene died in 1786, 3 years after the war, which is maybe one reason he didn't get the credit he deserved, but something to think about if you're over in Greene County. And I tell the story in the book about Lafayette's tour of America that took place in 1824 and 1825. He came over here as the nation's guest, they call it. And at that time, they were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Revolution, just as we're now at the 250th. And they called that the Jubilee of Independence. And Lafayette had first come over to America when he was 19 in 1777. And he was one of the richest men in France. And he was one of quite a collection of Europeans, idealistic Europeans, who saw in America that something utterly new was happening, that there was going to be this real revolution in human affairs, and it could spread around the world, and they wanted to be part of it. So they came over, many of them fairly young. Lafayette, as I said, was 19. The Congress made him a major general just to give him, because they thought, well, he's got a lot of money, we could butter him up. But it turned out he was a good officer. He led troops in battle. He was wounded in the Battle of Brandywine down in Philadelphia. And he served as a kind of right-hand man for George Washington. made tremendous contributions, would often go back to France and negotiate with the French to keep the supplies and the support from France coming, which was vitally important to the Patriot cause. But now, in 1824, he was an old man. He was 68 years old. And when he came over, the Americans woke up to the fact that he was the last major general still alive from the Revolutionary War. And pretty soon, what they called the Boys of 76 would all be gone. So there was a great outpouring of emotion and patriotism and nostalgia looking back in the Revolutionary era. And they had all kinds of celebrations and parades and ceremonies. Lafayette went to many dinners and there were many toasts raised to him. There were many places named for him. When I was driving over here, I came through Lafayetteville. It's in a little hamlet in the town of Milan. LaGrange, down by Poughkeepsie. That town is named for Lafayette's estate in France. It was very widely known in those days. LaGrange, that was associated with Lafayette. Fayetteville, West Virginia, was named for Lafayette. He brought his son over. They toured the entire country, and they were here for almost 2 years. There were 24 states then. He went to every state. He greeted the men who he remembered having led in battle and remembered a lot of their names 50 years later. He went to the graves of the people who had since died, which was a lot of them, including George Washington, who he considered his adopted father. George Washington had no children of his own, and Lafayette was an orphan. So they had this sort of father-son bonding, and he was a great supporter of George Washington. And when he came out of the crypt where George and Martha Washington were buried, his face was streaming with tears. He visited Red Hook, New York, and went to see Janet Livingston. She had built a house over on the Hudson River, which is still there. It's recently been bought by Bard College, Montgomery Place, I think. And she had never married, and she had really devoted her life to keeping alive the memory of her martyred husband. And during this tour, and he came down the Erie Canal. He's one of the first people to ride on the Erie Canal. It had just been finished. And during his tour, he was asked to lay a cornerstone for a charitable project in Brooklyn Heights in New York City that was a library for poor apprentice boys. And these are boys that they couldn't go to school because they were working, so they wanted to give them an opportunity to learn something. So they're going to build a library for them. And they brought some of these boys over to be in the presence of this living legend, Lafayette. And some of them were so small they couldn't see what was going on, so they had to lift them up and put them over to a different vantage point. And one of the boys that Lafayette lifted up in his arms was a 6-year-old named Walt Whitman. And of course, Whitman was from Brooklyn and was an apprentice. And Whitman never forgot that. He talked about it all his life at the time when he was in the arms of Lafayette. And later in his poetry, he wrote, "I understand the large hearts of heroes." And it was a phrase that stuck in my mind because I started thinking, of these very diverse men and women who contributed to the revolution, and they had their weaknesses and their uncertainties and their burdens, and they made their mistakes, but they all had this thing in common. They had large hearts. And if you read the letters and diaries of that time, the people often mentioned that they thought that they were sacrificing for the freedom of generations unborn. They used that phrase. And I would just point out that we are those generations, and they were fighting for us. Thank you very much.